Shalom, everyone. As we turn to our weekly Parsha, Amor, we find one of the most controversial ideas of justice found in the Torah, which is the concept of an eye for an eye. This causes us to ask an unsolvable question. What is the value of human life and limb? This is a question that has stumped theologians and philosophers for centuries. While philosophical answers tend to see human life as being priceless, in a more tangible way, actuaries have the challenging task of coming up with concrete numbers. Different government agencies or departments and insurance companies require the calculation of actual figures. We might ask, how is this even possible to accomplish? Is it $1 million, 9 million, 50, more or less? Despite the need for such figures in crafting public policy, this all sounds a bit unseemly, to say the least. Parshat Emor's provocative concept of justice specifically deals with the challenging dilemma, stating, if anyone maims his fellow, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury he inflicted on another shall be inflicted on him. And so, at first, the meaning seems relatively straightforward. If I break your arm, you get to break my arm. But as our sages realize, we quickly run into a whole host of practical problems if we attempt to interpret these verses literally. Let's say my arm breaks after my neighbor runs over it with their dairy cart. And so, to inflict an equivalent injury, the Torah states that we will need to get the same cart and place it on the same surface, traveling at the same speed, running over my neighbor's arm in the same spot. And even then, there is no guarantee that they will suffer the same injury. They may get up completely unscathed, or conversely, they may be injured so significantly that they require surgery, or risk infection or amputation even. It gets even more complicated as Abraham ibn Ezra writes in the name of Sadia Gaon. He writes, if a person deprived his fellow of a third of his normal sight by his strike, how could a retaliatory blow be so calculated as to have the same precise results, neither more nor less? Or, as Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai teaches in Bava Kama, if a blind man maims another by blinding him, how is an eye for an eye considered just or sufficient compensation? Our sages wrestled with these questions and realized the literal application of eye for eye was impractical, if not impossible, to carry out. The medieval commentator Maimonides explains the solution, writing that the above verse does not mean the literal inflicting of the identical maiming on the guilty person, but merely that while the latter might deserve such maiming, such punishment, he pays the monetary equivalent. We find that nearly all of our sages agree with Maimonides here, that this concept should not be carried out as a blood revenge, but rather through the payment of damages. And so in her commentary on Parshat Emor, Nechama Leibowitz writes that a person cannot dispose of his limbs in the same way that he can dispose of his goods, since his limbs, his entire body, are not under his authority. A person is not the master of their body, but God, to whom belongs both soul and body, is the master of them. Thus, no person has the right to inflict harm on another or upon themselves. When justice demands compensation for damages to another person's body, they may not harm their own. Only financial compensation will do. We could ask if an eye for an eye really means the value of an eye for an eye, then why doesn't the Torah say that? And perhaps we can try to answer this question in a different Shabbat Torah study of sorts. But let us return back to the fundamental difficulty of assigning a price to our lives or our bodies. The Jewish tradition formulated 5 categories to consider when calculating fair compensations. The sages took into account the permanence of injury, the pain of the injury, the medical treatments and the bills, potential loss of earnings, as well as the dignity or the status of the individual after sustaining an injury. However, regardless of how in-depth this assessment goes, ultimately we find that this system is lacking in some element. Our tradition teaches us that our bodies come from God. They are not mere objects that we can trade or have values. The Maharal of Prague explains that the priceless nature of our bodies is why the Torah avoids explicitly demanding the monetary compensation. That would show that we should not imagine that once the offender has paid some sort of compensation, that they are completely free and have no other obligations. In other words, no amount of money alone can make up for injury. Nahama Leibowitz further explains that the deeper meaning of these verses of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, stresses that human life is godly, priceless, and irreplaceable. Injury to another cannot be absolved merely by writing a check, no matter the amount. Instead, when we injure another person, we must not only provide appropriate restitution, but we must also seek atonement and forgiveness. Maimonides puts it this way: no compensation is complete, no wrong is forgiven until the person who has inflicted the injury requests the victim's forgiveness and has been forgiven. So, God willing, we will never find ourselves in such a position. But if we do, we can keep in mind that our lives and our bodies are beyond any worldly sum. May we remember to treat them accordingly. And in a time of heightened awareness of health and safety, may we be ever mindful that our well-being rests both in our own and each other's hands. So we wish you a Shabbat Shalom.